The rifle barrel trembled in Selim Weatherby's weathered hands as he aimed it at the shadowy figure crouched beside his barn. Lightning split the Montana sky, illuminating a woman unlike any he'd ever seen, hair wild as bramblewood, clothes torn and muddy, but eyes that burned with fierce intelligence even in the storm's chaos. "Don't move another muscle, stranger," he called over the thunder, though something in his chest had already shifted at the sight of her. She stood slowly, hands raised but chin defiant. "Easy there, rancher. I'm not here to steal your cattle." Her voice carried the rough music of someone who'd learned to speak to wind and wolves rather than civilized folk. "Then what are you doing skulking around my property at midnight in a goddamn tempest?" "Seeking shelter, same as any creature with sense." She stepped into the lantern light hanging from his porch, and Selim's breath caught. Beautiful wasn't the word. She was something elemental, like a storm given human form. My horse threw me 2 miles back. This storm came up faster than a striking snake. Selim had been alone on the Weatherby Ranch for 3 years, ever since consumption took his wife Melody. In all that time, he'd grown accustomed to the silence, to making decisions without considering another soul. But something about this wild woman made him lower his rifle despite every instinct screaming caution. "Name's Selim Weatherby. This is my land you're trespassing on." "Brenna Moonshadow," she replied without hesitation, though he suspected it. Wasn't the name on any church registry. "And I'm grateful for whatever shelter you might spare." The storm unleashed its full fury then, rain driving sideways and hail beginning to pepper the ground like bullets. Selim found himself stepping aside before his mind caught up with his body. "Barn's warm and dry. You can bed down in the loft." "Much obliged." She moved past him, bringing scents of pine sap and something indefinably wild, not unpleasant, but utterly foreign to his ordered world of cattle schedules and crop rotations. As she settled into the hay, Selim lingered in the barn doorway, watching lightning illuminate her face. There was something about Brenna Moonshadow that spoke to a part of him he'd buried with his wife, the part that had once dreamed of adventure beyond fence lines and township boundaries. Storm should pass by morning, he said, more to fill the charged silence than from any need for conversation. "Storms always do." Her voice drifted down from the loft, soft now but still carrying that wild edge. "Question is what they leave behind." Selim returned to his empty house, but sleep proved elusive. Through his bedroom window, he could see the faint glow of the lantern he'd left burning in the barn. For the first time in 3 years, his homestead didn't feel quite so hollow. He told himself it was just Christian charity that made him leave a plate of cornbread and preserved peaches by the barn door, along with a jar of fresh milk. But lying in his cold bed, listening to thunder roll across the valley, Selim Weatherby knew his life had already begun changing the moment he'd lowered that rifle. Selim woke before sunrise, as was his habit, but found himself moving toward the barn instead of the chicken coop for his morning chores. The storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and washed clean, but an odd restlessness drove his steps. The food he'd left was gone, but Brenna Moonshadow was nowhere to be seen. His chest tightened with unexpected disappointment until he heard singing a wild, wordless melody that seemed to flow with the morning breeze itself. Following the sound, he found her by his neglected vegetable garden, kneeling among the weeds he'd been meaning to clear for months. Her hands moved through the soil with practiced grace, and everywhere she touched, the earth seemed to respond. She'd somehow coaxed water from his old well pump and was tenderly washing the roots of plants he'd thought long dead. "What are you doing?" The question came out sharper than he'd intended. Born from 3 years of controlling every aspect of his land alone. She looked up, dirt streaking her cheeks but her eyes bright. "Saying thank you. This garden's got good bones, just needs someone to listen to what it's trying to tell you." "I don't have time for gardening anymore. the lie tasted bitter. Truth was, he'd abandoned the garden because Melody had loved it, and tending it without her felt like reopening a wound. "Time's funny thing," Brenna said, continuing her work. "We think we don't have enough, but it's usually that we're spending it on the wrong things." She gestured toward a half-dead tomato plant that was somehow showing new green growth under. Her ministrations. "This little one's been waiting 2 seasons for someone to care again." Something in her tone made Selim kneel beside her, studying the plant more closely. "How can you tell?" "Same way you can tell when cattle are fixing to bolt or when weather's changing. You listen with more than your ears." Her fingers brushed his as she guided his hand to touch the plant stem. "Feel that? The strength still flowing underneath?" He did feel it, a subtle vitality he'd never noticed before. But more than that, he felt the warmth of her skin, calloused from work but gentle as rain. When had he last touched another person? Really touched them, not just the polite handshakes. At church or the brief contacts of business transactions. "You know about cattle," she observed, settling back on her heels. "Born to it. My daddy worked this land and his daddy before him." He found himself talking easily, naturally, in a way he hadn't in years. "But I never had much gift with growing. Things that weren't grass." "Different skills, same heart," Brenna said. "Both about nurturing life, helping things thrive." She stood, wiping her hands on her torn dress. "I should be moving on. Imposed on your kindness long enough." "Where are you headed?" The question escaped before he could stop it. "Wherever the road takes me. I'm not much for staying put." Selim watched her prepare to leave. This strange woman who'd appeared in his storm and brought something back to life in his garden and maybe in himself. The old him would have let her go with a polite farewell. But the old him wouldn't have spent the night lying awake thinking about wild honey eyes and music in the wind. "Your horse," he said suddenly. "You mentioned it through you." 2 miles back. Up the mountain trail, probably halfway to Canada by now. "Could take you a week to walk to the nearest town from here." She shrugged. "I've walked further." "Stay another day," he heard himself say. "Help me with that garden if you've a mind to. I'll ride out and look for your horse." The offer hung between them like morning mist, fragile and shimmering with possibility. Brenna's pause stretched long enough for Selim to regret his impulsive invitation, but then she smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her, transforming her entire face from merely striking to genuinely radiant. "One more day," she agreed, "but I'll earn my keep properly." She proved true to her word. While Selim rode into the foothills searching for her missing horse, Brenna transformed his homestead. He returned empty-handed near sunset to find laundry flapping on lines he'd forgotten he owned, windows gleaming, and the most incredible smells drifting from his kitchen. "Find anything?" she called from where she knelt weeding the garden that already looked twice as healthy as it had that morning. "Horse." Tracks headed north toward the high country. Could take days to catch up. He dismounted, studying her work. "Brenna, you didn't need to." "Hush." She stood, brushing dirt from her knees. "When's the last time you ate a proper meal?" The question caught him off guard. He'd been surviving on bacon, beans, and whatever he could grab quickly between chores. "I manage fine. That's not what I asked." Her direct gaze made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't name. "Since before Melody died, I reckon. She did the cooking." "Thought so." No pity in her voice, just matter-of-fact understanding. "Well, tonight you eat like a human being instead of a hungry wolf." The meal she'd prepared from his meager supplies was unlike anything he'd tasted, wild herbs he didn't recognize blended with familiar ingredients to create flavors both comforting and exotic. They ate by lamplight at his kitchen table, the silence comfortable rather than awkward. "You're not really from around here," he observed over coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. "Define around here." Her eyes held secrets like deep water. "Holds mysteries." Montana, Colorado. Hell, maybe not even these United States. She laughed, a sound like silver bells caught in mountain wind. I'm from wherever I happen to be standing. Been that way since I was 15 and realized home isn't a place, it's a feeling. What happened when you were 15? The light in her eyes dimmed slightly. Lost my folks to a fever. Had kinfolk who would have taken me in, but they wanted to tame me, make me into something I wasn't. So I left. How long ago? Long enough? She deflected his probe smoothly. What about you? Always been a rancher? Always wanted to be. Had dreams of expanding the herd, maybe buying the Morrison place when old Jake retired. He stared into his coffee. Dreams change when you're doing everything alone. Or maybe you just forgot they were still there. Something in her tone made him look up. She was watching him with an intensity that seemed to see straight through to his bones. You're not the first widower I've met, Selim Weatherby. World's full of people who think their lives ended when someone else's did. But you're still breathing. Still strong, still got all your pieces. Question is what you plan to do with them. The observation stung because it rang true. He'd been existing, not living, going through motions without purpose beyond basic survival. Easy enough to say when you don't have responsibilities, he said, immediately regretting the defensive edge in his voice. Is that what you think? That I'm free because I don't care about anything? She stood abruptly, moving to the window to stare out at the star-scattered sky. I've left pieces of my heart in a dozen places, Selim. Difference is, I keep looking for new places to put the pieces that are left. The admission hung between them, raw and honest. He found himself standing too, drawn by something he couldn't name. Brenna, one day, she said softly, not turning around. I promised one day, and tomorrow I'll keep moving. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. But as she passed him heading for the door, their shoulders brushed, and the contact sent lightning through his veins that had nothing to do with the previous night's storm. Selim spent the night pacing his bedroom floor like a caged wolf. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Brenna's face in the lamplight, heard her voice asking what he planned to do with the pieces of his life still left. When dawn finally broke, he found her already up, sitting on his porch steps with coffee and watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold. Couldn't sleep either? She asked without looking at him. He settled beside her, close enough to catch that wild pine scent that seemed to cling to her skin. Keep thinking about what you said, about pieces. Dangerous thing, thinking too much. Maybe. Or maybe I haven't been thinking enough. He turned to study her profile, the strong line of her jaw, the way morning light caught in her tangled hair. How do you do it? Keep moving, keep leaving, same way you keep staying. One day at a time, until it becomes habit. She sipped her coffee, steam curling between them. But I'll tell you a secret, rancher, it gets harder every year. Then why not stop? Because stopping means choosing. And choosing means risking everything on one throw of the dice. She finally looked at him, and he saw something vulnerable flickering beneath her wild confidence. What if I choose wrong? What if I stop running and discover I was right to keep moving all along? The question revealed more than she'd probably intended. Selim recognized the fear because he'd been living with its mirror image for 3 years. Terror that if he ever truly lived again, he might discover happiness was possible without melody. And wouldn't that be the ultimate betrayal? Brenna. Her name felt different on his tongue now, heavier with meaning. What if you choose, right? Before she could answer, the thunder of hoofbeats interrupted them. 3 riders approached fast from the East Sheriff Dalton, and 2 men Selim didn't recognize, their faces grim with purpose. Brenna went utterly still beside him, tension radiating from her like heat from forge fire. Selim, she said quietly, I need you to trust me now. What's wrong? Just trust me. Sheriff Dalton reined up before the porch, his usually friendly demeanor replaced by professional seriousness. "Morning, Selim. Need to have a word with your guest." "What about?" Selim stood slowly, something protective and primitive awakening in his chest. "Miss Moonshadow, if that's her real name, is wanted for questioning in connection with a robbery in Copper Falls 3 days ago." Dalton's hand rested on his gun butt. Stage was held up, driver killed. Witnesses described a woman matching her description. Selim's world tilted. He looked down at Brenna, searching her face for denial, for explanation, for anything that would make this make sense. But her expression had gone carefully blank, revealing nothing. "That true?" he asked quietly. She held his gaze steadily. "Would it matter if it was?" The question hit him like a physical blow. 3 days ago, she'd claimed to be seeking shelter from a storm. But Copper Falls was 2 days' hard ride east. She could have easily made it here by the time she appeared. At his barn. "Ma'am, you need to come with us," one of the strangers said, dismounting with his hand on his weapon. "Don't think so," Brenna replied conversationally, but Selim caught the subtle shift in her posture, the way she balanced on the balls of her feet like a cat preparing to spring. "Brenna, don't," he said urgently. "If you're innocent, innocence got nothing to do with it," she cut him off. "World's not interested in innocent when it comes to people like me." And with that, she moved. Not toward the horses or the road, but in a direction that took Selim's breath away straight at him. Before he could react, she kissed him, hard and desperate and tasting of coffee and wild honey and goodbye. "I'm sorry," she whispered against his lips. "For all of it." Then she vaulted over the porch railing and ran, not toward the mountains as he'd expected, but straight toward his barn where the morning sun would blind the shooters. If they tried to follow, the sound of gunfire split the morning. Air and Selim's heart stopped. He lunged toward the barn, but Sheriff Dalton caught his arm. "Stay back, Selim. This isn't your fight. Like hell it isn't." He shook off the sheriff's grip, surprising himself with the vehemence in his voice. "That's my property she's on, and she's a suspected murderer and thief." "Suspected," Selim repeated, the word tasting bitter. "You got proof, or just the word of witnesses who probably never saw a woman like her before in their lives?" Dalton's eyes narrowed. "You defending her?" "I'm asking for facts instead of assumptions." The two strangers had dismounted and were approaching the barn with drawn weapons, moving with the careful precision of men who'd done this before. Bounty hunters, Selim realized with a chill. Not lawmen at all, just predators following a scent. Who? Are they Dalton? Pinkerton agents? Railroad hired them to track down the gang that's been hitting their stages. Gang? One woman? Woman was with 2 men, according to witnesses. They scattered after the robbery. From inside the barn came the sound of his horses whinnying in distress. Selim took another step toward the building, every instinct screaming at him to get between Brenna and those guns. "Selim." Dalton's voice carried warning. "Think careful before you do something stupid. You're a respected member of this community. Don't throw that away for a stranger." But that was just it. She didn't feel like a stranger anymore. In less than 2 days, Brenna Moonshadow had brought his garden back to life, filled his house with warmth and laughter, made him remember what it felt like to be fully alive. If that was worth nothing against the word of strangers and the hunger of bounty hunters, then what was the point of any of it? "Come out peaceful, miss," one of the Pinkertons called toward the barn. "No need for anyone else to get hurt." "Anyone else?" Selim repeated sharply. "Who's been hurt?" Dalton shifted uncomfortably. "Stage driver in Copper Falls. But that might not have been her," Selim finished. "So you're willing to gun down a woman on might not have been?" Before anyone could answer, Brenna appeared in the barn doorway. But she wasn't cowering or surrendering. She sat astride his best stallion, bareback and confident as if she'd been born to it. In her hands was his old Henry rifle, and the way she held it suggested she knew exactly how to use it. "Gentlemen," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "Seems we have ourselves a Mexican standoff." "Miss, you're just making this worse for yourself," the second Pinkerton said. "Hard to make it worse when your plan involves me being dead or in chains either way." She kept the rifle trained on them while somehow maintaining perfect control of the horse. "So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to ride out of here, and you're going to let me." "Can't do that, ma'am." "Then we have a problem." Selim found himself stepping forward before conscious thought caught up with action. What if I vouched for her? Every eye turned to him. "What?" Dalton asked. "What if I gave my word she'd come to trial peacefully? Stood surety for her?" "Selim, no," Brenna called from horseback, and he heard something like anguish in her voice. "You don't even know if she's guilty," he called back. "Doesn't matter. I won't let you risk everything for me." But it did matter, he realized. It mattered. More than his reputation, more than his comfortable isolation, more than the safe life he built from routine and emotional numbness. In 2 days, this wild woman had reminded him what it felt like to be truly alive, and he'd be damned if he'd let them take that away without a fight. "I know her," he said firmly, "and I'm willing to stake my life on her character." "Your life might be exactly what you're staking," one of the Pinkertons warned. Selim looked up at Brenna, sitting proud and fierce on his horse, and made his choice. Then so be it. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring until Sheriff Dalton raised his hand. "Hold on, everybody just hold on." He dismounted slowly, hands visible. "Selim, you're talking about posting bond for a woman you met 2 days ago. Think about what you're saying. I'm saying she deserves a fair trial, not a lynching." Selim kept his eyes on Brenna. "I'm saying sometimes you have to trust what your gut tells you about people. And what's your gut telling you about her?" Before Selim could answer, Brenna spoke from horseback, her voice carrying a weight of exhaustion he hadn't heard before. "Tell him, Selim. Tell him I could have slit your throat any time in the past 2 days if I'd wanted to. Tell him I had plenty of chances to rob you blind and disappear." "She's right," he said. "Had the run of my house, knew where I keep my money, could have taken my best horses. Instead, she cooked my meals and brought my garden back to life." One of the Pinkertons spat in the dust. "Pretty words don't change. Facts. Woman fits the description, and she was in the area when the crime happened." "What description?" Brenna called out, and there was something sharp in her voice now. "Exactly what did your witnesses tell you?" The men exchanged glances. "Dark-haired woman," the first Pinkerton said. "Wild-looking, dressed in men's clothes. Height? Tall. 5'8", maybe 9. Brenna laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I'm 5'4" in boots. Try again." "You could have been crouched down, or maybe your witnesses saw what they expected to see when they looked at a woman who doesn't fit their idea of proper." Her voice carried the bitter knowledge of someone who'd faced such assumptions before. "How many dark-haired women do you suppose live in this territory? 100? 1,000? Selim found himself studying the men's faces, seeing uncertainty creep into their expressions. "You don't really know it was her, do you?" "Evidence suggests." "Evidence suggests you're chasing shadows," Brenna interrupted. "But that's easier than admitting you lost the real trail, isn't it?" Sheriff Dalton held up his hand again. "All right, that's enough. Miss, you need to come with us, but I give you my word you'll get a fair hearing." "Like the fair hearing I got in Denver, or the one in Santa Fe?" Brenna's knuckles were white on the rifle stock. "I've seen your kind of justice before, Sheriff. What happened in Denver?" Selim asked quietly. Her laugh was brittle as autumn leaves. Accused of stealing horses I was trying to return to their rightful owner. Spent 6 months in jail before the real thief was caught red-handed. She looked directly at him. That's When I learned that sometimes being innocent isn't enough. Sometimes you're guilty of the crime of not fitting in. The weight of her words settled over the group like dust after a windstorm. Selim could see the truth of it in her eyes, the accumulated pain of someone who'd been judged by appearance rather than actions, condemned by suspicion rather than evidence. "Sheriff," he said slowly, "what if there was another way? I'm listening. Give me a week. Let me take her to Copper Falls myself, talk to these witnesses face to face. If they can identify her for certain, I'll bring her back for trial myself." "Selim, no," Brenna said again, but he heard something different in her voice now, not just refusal, but something that might have been hope. "1 week," he repeated. "My word as bond. If I'm wrong about her, I'll face the consequences." The two Pinkertons looked ready to object, but Dalton held up a weathered hand. "You'd risk everything on a stranger's word?" Selim looked up at Brenna, still mounted and ready to run, but her eyes locked on his with an intensity that seemed to burn straight through to his soul. "She's not a stranger," he said quietly. "Not anymore." 3 days into their journey to Copper Falls, Selim began to understand why Brenna had spent years running rather than staying. She moved through the wilderness like she was part of it, reading signs in bent grass and disturbed stones that told stories he couldn't even see. More than once, her warnings steered them away from washouts or unstable trail that would have cost them precious time or worse. "How do you know all this?" he asked as she guided them around a rockfall that had happened so recently the dust hadn't settled. "When you don't have walls around you, you learn to read the world differently," she said, dismounting to study the fresh scar on the mountainside. "This happened yesterday, maybe the day before. Means there's been heavy rain up high. We haven't seen rain. Mountains make their own weather." She remounted with fluid grace. "Storm that missed us might have dumped inches on the peaks. Water's got to go somewhere." As if summoned by her words, they heard the distant roar of swollen creeks rushing down from the high country. The sound made Selim grateful all over again for her knowledge, but it also highlighted how little he really knew about the woman he'd risked everything to defend. "Tell me about the real robbery," he said as they made camp that evening beside a stream that ran clear and cold from Snowmelt. Her hand stilled on the coffee pot. "What makes you think I know anything about it?" "Because you knew too much about what the witnesses said, how the law works in cases like this. And because you've been thinking 3 moves ahead since we left the ranch." She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she sighed, settling back against her saddle. "I was in Copper Falls that day. Not for any robbery. I was tracking a horse thief who'd stolen from a family I'd been staying with." "You found him?" "Found him, all right. In the saloon, bragging about how easy it had been to take advantage of simple farm folk." Her voice carried cold anger. "Had their prize Mari with him, planned to sell her to the stage company. What did you do?" "What I always do. Waited until dark, took back what was stolen, left the thief tied up for the sheriff to find." She poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the star-scattered sky. "Except this time, someone saw me leading the Mari out of town. By the time the stage was robbed the next morning, witnesses had already decided I was trouble. So, you ran. So I ran, like I always do." She looked at him across the flickering firelight. "Like I should have done from your ranch before you got pulled into this." "I pulled myself in," Selim said firmly. "And I'm not sorry. You will be if this goes wrong. Will one?" He leaned forward, studying her face. "Brenna, in 3 years of living alone on that ranch, I never once felt as alive as I have these past few days. Even with the danger, even with all this uncertainty, I'd rather be here with you than safe and numb in my empty house." Something flickered in her eyes, surprise, maybe, or fear. "Don't say things like that." "Why not, if they're true?" "Because true doesn't mean smart. Because I'm not the settling kind, and you're not the running kind, and there's no middle ground between those two ways of living." "How do you know? Have you tried?" The question hung between them like smoke from there. Fire. When she didn't answer, Selim found himself moving around the fire to sit beside her, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her skin. "I loved my wife," he said quietly. "Loved her with everything I had. When she died, I thought that. Was it for me? Thought I'd used up my chance at happiness. Maybe you had. Or maybe I just convinced myself I had because it was easier than risking it again." He turned to face her fully. "You make me want to risk it again, Brenna." She was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I've never stayed anywhere long enough to find out what I might be if I stopped running." "Want to find out?" "Wanting and doing are different things. So are running and being free." That made her look at him, really look at him, and he saw centuries of loneliness in her eyes. Without thinking, he reached out to touch her cheek, and she leaned into the contact like a wild thing finally allowing itself to be gentled. "What if we clear your name in Copper Falls?" he asked. "What then?" "Then I disappear and you go back to your safe life." "What if I don't want my safe life anymore?" Copper Falls looked like every other mining boomtown Selim had ever seen hastily. Built, roughly painted, and filled with people trying to strike it rich or forget why they'd failed to do so elsewhere. The main street bustled with activity even at midday, but he noticed how conversation stopped when he and Brenna rode through. "They know you here," he observed. "Towns like this have long memories for trouble," she replied, but he caught the way her shoulders squared, the subtle shift to alertness that meant she was ready for anything. They found Sheriff McKenna at his office, a tired-looking man with graying hair and the kind of steady eyes that suggested he'd seen everything at least twice. He looked up when they entered, recognition flickering across his features. "Miss Moonshadow. Heard you were wanted for questioning." "Heard the same thing," Brenna replied evenly. "Figured I'd come set the record straight. This is Selim Weatherby," she added, gesturing to him. "He's vouching for my character." McKenna studied them both carefully. "That so? What's your interest in this, Mr. Weatherby?" "Same as yours should be," Selim said. "Making sure justice gets done right." "Justice." McKenna leaned back in his chair. "Funny thing about justice in cases like this. Witnesses see what they expect to see, especially when it comes to women who don't fit the usual mold." "So you don't think she did it?" Selim said. "I think somebody robbed that stage and killed my friend Tommy Martinez, who was driving it. I think the folks who saw it were scared and looking for someone to blame." He looked directly at Brenna. "And I think you were in town at the wrong time, asking the wrong questions about horse thieves." "You know about that?" "Found Jeremiah Stokes tied up behind the saloon the morning after the robbery. Had a lot to say about a crazy mountain woman who'd taken back what he'd stolen fair and square." McKenna's mouth quirked slightly. "His words, not mine." "Did you investigate?" Selim asked. "Course I did. Stokes had been bragging for 2 days about the fine mare he'd acquired cheap. When I checked with the farming family he mentioned, they confirmed she'd been stolen from their property 3 weeks prior." He pulled out a folder from his desk drawer. "Miss Moonshadow here saved me the trouble of tracking down their livestock." Brenna sat forward. "Then why?" "Because 3 men from the Pinkerton agency showed up the day after the robbery with witness descriptions that could fit half the women in this territory, and they had authorization from the railroad to pursue all leads." McKenna's expression hardened. "They were more interested in closing the case than solving it," What about the real robbers? Selim asked, still working on that. But I'll tell you what I told them. The gang that hit the stage knew the route, knew the schedule, knew exactly where to set up their ambush. That suggests local knowledge, not some drifter passing through. Relief flooded through Selim like cool water after a long drought. But when he looked at Brenna, her expression remained guarded. "Sheriff," she said carefully, "I appreciate you setting the record straight. But those Pinkerton men aren't going to give up easy." "No, they're not. They've got reputations to protect and bounties to collect." McKenna stood, moving to look out his window at the busy street. "But they also don't have jurisdiction in my town anymore." "What do you mean?" "Got a telegram this morning from the territorial marshal. Seems someone," he glanced meaningfully at Selim, "sent word about irregular procedures in a federal investigation. Marshal sending his own man to take over the case." Selim felt his cheeks warm. He'd sent that telegram from the last town they'd passed through, calling in a favor from an old army buddy who'd gone into law enforcement. "I just wanted to make sure she got fair treatment." "Fair treatment," McKenna repeated. "Novel concept. Around here lately," he turned back to them. "Miss Moonshadow, you're free to go. I'd suggest you stay clear of those Pinkerton boys, though. They don't take kindly to having their work questioned." As they prepared to leave, McKenna called after them. "One more thing. Tommy Martinez had a wife and 3 young children. If you happen to come across any information about who really killed him, I'd appreciate hearing it." Outside, Brenna was quiet as they walked toward their horses. Finally, Selim couldn't stand it anymore. "You're cleared," he said. "It's over." "Is it?" She looked at him with eyes that held too much knowledge of how the world really worked. "Being innocent and being safe are 2 different things, Selim. Always have been." They made camp that night beside a clear mountain lake, its surface mirror smooth, and reflecting the first stars like scattered diamonds. Selim watched Brenna move through the familiar routines of making camp, but something had changed in her demeanor since leaving Copper Falls. She was quieter, more thoughtful, like someone wrestling with a decision that could change everything. "Penny for your thoughts," he said as they sat by the fire, sharing coffee and jerky. "Just thinking about what Sheriff McKenna said, about the real robbers having local knowledge." She poked at the coals with a stick, sending sparks dancing upward. "I've been tracking men like that for years, Selim. Men who prey on honest folks and disappear into the wilderness. You're thinking of going after them. I'm thinking they killed a good man and left 3 children without a father. That doesn't sit right with me." Selim studied her face in the firelight, seeing the fierce sense of justice that drove her to return stolen horses and right wrongs wherever she found them. It was part of what drew him to her, this wild woman who couldn't ignore suffering even when it meant risking her own safety. "What if we went after them together?" The suggestion surprised him as much as it did her. She looked up sharply. "Selim, you're a rancher, not a manhunter." "I'm a man who spent 3 years being half alive," he corrected. "And I'm tired of watching life happen to other people while I hide behind fence posts and routine. This isn't some adventure story. People die doing what I do. People die doing nothing, too. They just do it slower and more safely." He leaned forward, meeting her gaze directly. "Brenna, I meant what I said before. You've reminded me what it feels like to be truly alive. I don't want to go back to just existing." She was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft with something that might have been wonder. "You really mean it, don't you? You'd give up your safe life, your ranch, everything you've built?" "I'd give up the illusion of safety for the reality of living," he said. "But I wouldn't be giving up my ranch. I'd be expanding what it means to me." "I don't follow." Selim took a deep breath, voicing thoughts that had been forming since they'd left Copper Falls. What if the ranch became a place where people like you could stop running? A safe haven for folks who don't fit the usual molds but need somewhere to rest, regroup, heal? Her eyes widened. I'm talking about using what I have to make a difference. Using the land, the resources, the safety of an established homestead to help people who need it. He reached across the fire to take her hand. I'm talking about building something together instead of you running alone and me hiding alone. Selim. His name came out like a prayer. Do you have any idea what you're suggesting? The kind of trouble that would bring to your door? The kind of trouble that comes with doing what's right instead of what's safe. He squeezed her fingers gently. I can live with that kind of trouble. She pulled her hand free, standing abruptly. To pace beside the lake. You don't understand. I've never stayed anywhere longer than a season. Never put down roots. Never made promises I might not be able to keep. Then don't make promises, he said, rising to follow her. Just stay. See. What happens? What if I disappoint you? What if I can't be what you need? What if you can't be what I need? He turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. Brenna, I'm not asking you to change who you are. I'm asking you to be who you are in a place where that's valued, instead of feared. The moonlight caught the tears gathering in her eyes. I'm scared, she whispered, the admission seeming to surprise her as much as him. Of what? Of wanting this too much. Of letting myself believe it could work. She looked up at him, vulnerability naked in her expression. Of losing you after I've finally found something worth keeping. You won't lose me, he said firmly, and I won't lose you. Not to fear, not to doubt, and sure as hell not to anyone who thinks they can judge what we have without understanding it. For a moment, they stood suspended between possibility and an avanas. Doubt, between the safe loneliness they'd known and the risky joy they might discover together. Then Brenna smiled the first truly unguarded smile he'd seen from her, and the last of his doubts dissolved like morning mist. All right, rancher, she said, rising on her toes to kiss him softly. Let's go home and see what kind of life we can build together. Home, he repeated against her lips, tasting the word like honey. I like the sound of that. As they held each other beside the moonlit lake, Selim Weatherby realized that sometimes the most important storms were the ones that brought exactly what you needed, even when you didn't know you needed it. He'd offered shelter to a wild woman for one night, and by morning, she'd changed everything, not by taming his world, but by teaching him that the best kind of life was one lived without walls, where love grew wild and free and strong enough to weather any storm. Together, they would return to his ranch and transform it into something neither had imagined possible alone. A place where broken things could heal, where running could finally end, and where two hearts that had been wandering could finally come home to each other.